Hi, and thanks for watching this message video. And don't forget to go through the life lesson that goes with it. And for those who can't make a Sunday, don't forget that there's a podcast of that sermon that goes along with this message video and life lesson, kind of a part one, part two thing. Today, we're continuing on in our series through the book of Hebrews chapter by chapter, and we're going through chapter 11. But if you know the way that chapters work, our original author didn't see it that way. And so there's some thoughts from chapter 10 that actually carry over into chapter 11. And the primary thought is that of faith. In fact, at the end of chapter 10, he was demonstrating, or at least talking about, what the differences are about a person who has faith versus a person who turns away. And God's not pleased with that at all. And then he continues on in chapter 11 by giving examples of that sort of thing, of what faith means exactly, or really a definition of it. Here's what our author says. Hebrews 10:38 through 11:6. And my righteous ones will live by faith, but I will take no pleasure in anyone who turns away. But we are not like those who turn away from God to their own destruction. We are the faithful ones whose souls will be saved. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. Through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. By faith, we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command, that what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen. It was by faith that Abel brought a more acceptable offering to God than Cain did. Abel's offering gave evidence that he was a righteous man, and God showed his approval of his gifts. Although Abel is long dead, he still speaks to us by his example of faith. It was by faith that Enoch was taken up to heaven without dying. He disappeared because God took him. For before he was taken up, he was shown as a person who pleased God. And it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to him must believe that God exists and that he rewards those who sincerely seek him. From what our author writes, it appears that Abel couldn't see God, but because he believed that God existed, he brought an acceptable offering to him, versus Cain, who didn't. And then there's Enoch, who, again, didn't ever see God, but the way that he lived was so pleasing to God that God was like, hey, come on up here, I love you. And so in both of these instances, what we see from our author is that he is pointing out not necessarily statements of faith made by Abel or Enoch about their acknowledgement of God's existence. No, he talked about their actions that demonstrated their faith in God. Now, actions are critical, and we should all know this. For as James, the brother of Jesus, said, how foolish. Can't you see that faith without good deeds is useless? So when providing examples of faith, he points to those who had great faith by pointing out their actions or their deeds. For instance, look at who he mentions next. Hebrews 11:7 through 12. It was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God, who warned him about things that had never happened before. By his faith, Noah condemned the rest of the world, and he received the righteousness that comes by faith. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith, for he was like a foreigner, living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. And so a whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead. A nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there is no way to count them. Even though there was never a thing called rain before, Noah was asked to believe in God and trust in him that not only was there going to be a thing called rain that was going to happen, but that it was going to happen so much that there was going to be water that covered everything. So he needed to build this great big boat, and who knows what kind of harassment or what kind of ridicule. What we do know, though, is that the story makes it very clear is that Noah, by his faith, was the guy that ended up receiving righteousness, whereas everybody else who didn't display faith, they were destroyed. And then there's the story of Abraham and Sarah, who, at this point in time, they really don't know anything about God. They just know gods. And then here's God who shows up to them and says, hey, I want to take you to a new land that I'm going to bless you with, make it all yours, and just I know the one thing you want, kids. I'm going to give them to you, even though you're old. And not only do they trust God to the point where they believe what he said that he would do, which seemed impossible, they were willing to move to a new land and continue to live in tents instead of palaces because they believed, yeah, someday God's promise is going to come true on this. Now, what's consistent in both of these stories is that when people expressed their faith in God throughout the Bible, it was always demonstrated in front of others. So, one of the things we should learn about faith from this chapter of Hebrews is that it's never intended to be a private thing. It's supposed to be a public thing where other people can now, because of our actions, see that we believe and trust. And not only that, have a relationship with God. Now, there is another consistency in all these stories, and that's what our author mentions next. Hebrews 11:13 through 16. All these people died still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country they can call their own. If they had longed for the country they came from, they would have gone back. But they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That is why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. According to our author, every single one of the people that he's mentioned so far had this belief or faith and trust in something that God had promised to them, i.e., a home, not just a home, but all the cool stuff that goes along with the home, and that all the way up to the point of death, they were still trusting that God was going to deliver on that promise to bring them into that heavenly rest or that place where ultimately their home would be and they would enjoy all the things that God had promised in that city. Now, all of these people, again, are examples in this one consistency that they had not been given exactly all that God had promised, but yet they still believed that God was going to, all the way up to their point of death, which means they went through hard things. They went through difficult things in front of other people, and rather than giving up and going, forget it, this is all just a pile, they continued to stay the course and live faithfully for God. Now, did Abraham make a bunch of mistakes along the way? Yes, but he corrected and he continued to move back into a place where he was on the right path, even when things didn't make sense. And the truth of it is, when it comes to the category of being asked by God to do things, it doesn't make any sense. Abraham's by far the winner in that category, which is why our author writes about him in that particular situation with Isaac next. Hebrews 11:17 through 19. It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. According to Peter, similar to the way that God tested Abraham with his faith, God tests us with our faith. And that when those types of things are happening, that we're supposed to view it as him trying to purify our faith, like what fire purifies gold, even though our faith is more precious than gold. And so when we're going through difficult circumstances or trials in front of others, that's when we should demonstrate our faith in God rather than dread. That's when we are supposed to, in a way, through actions or deeds, demonstrate for them that we really truly do believe that God exists and therefore he is worthy of our praise or worthy of our obedience or worthy of our endurance. In fact, this emphasis on actions associated with faith was so important to the author of Hebrews that he's literally mentioned that with every single person so far. And then look at what he goes on to write next. Hebrews 11:20 through 40. It was by faith that Isaac promised blessings for the future to his sons, Jacob and Esau. It was by faith that Jacob, when he was old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's command. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who was invisible. It was by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover and to sprinkle blood on the doorposts so that the angel of death would not kill their firstborn sons. It was by faith that the people of Israel went right through the Red Sea as though they were on dry ground. But when the Egyptians tried to follow, they were all drowned. It was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days, and the walls came crashing down. It was by faith that Rahab the prostitute was not destroyed with the people in her city who refused to obey God, for she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. How much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women received their loved ones back again from death, but others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prison. Some died by stoning. Some were sawed in half, and others were killed with the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith. Yet none of them received all that God had promised, for God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. As the author of Hebrews alludes to, those that are in heaven have not received all the promises that God has made since he started making promises. Why? Well, the fulfillment of all of those promises is going to culminate in the biggest and best party ever, and you and I are on the invite list, and so are a lot of other people, and so God is waiting to throw that party until we're all there. Now, until then, what he's asked for us to do is to remain faithful, or i.e., live out that faith through actions and deeds, and to keep our thoughts on heaven, where our real home is, this heavenly rest that God has called everybody to. In fact, this is so important. It's what I'm going to be talking about on Sunday, and I hope you can join us.